Welcome everyone, welcome to this year's RomeMed 2021 Migration Forum, and thank you for being here, thank you for making it, to those who are here in presence, thank you for joining us online, for those of you who didn't make it. Actually, some of you who were foreseen to be here today could not make it due to the pandemic striking back in the past few days. So anyway, thank you for taking time and making time for joining us online. So thank you all. And right now, I'll briefly explain how it works, how this works. We will be talking about migration development in the first session, and then legal channels for migration in the second one. But before we start, I want to leave the floor for the opening remarks to Paolo Crudele, who is Principal Director at the Directorate General for Migration Policies and Italians Abroad. And then following up, it will be Lawrence Hart, Director for the Coordination Office for the Mediterranean at the IOM. Thank you. Mr. Crudele, you have the floor. Maybe.
Yes, very well.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Many thanks for having me at this event. Let me express my congratulations to ISPI for setting up this forum on migration. It is important we keep up talking about migration policies. Most of all, it is important to talk about migration in pragmatic terms and not simply according to the narrative of emergency and crisis. I do not want to downplay the emergency, of course. Due to its geographical position, Italy has always been involved in complex migration processes. Particularly today, as a country at the external borders of the European Union, we remain among the main member states for irregular arrivals by sea. We are also at the forefront of rescue operations and reception of migrants. So allow me to recall that in the past years, Italy has never stepped down from its obligations to save human lives at sea. But besides that, we should always keep in mind that well-managed migration can be an opportunity for all. The answer should not and cannot be merely containing the phenomenon in terms of emergency. The key is in dialogue among countries of origin, transit, and destination. Italy has been strengthening its international cooperation for years now with an integrated approach. We established the Migration Fund in 2017, and we have developed an intense dialogue with partners, mostly in Northern and Central Africa, investing in human and financial resources to support institutions in countries that are most affected by human trafficking, and providing assistance to refugees and migrants together to local communities. This effort through the Migration Fund has counted on the close and extraordinary partnership with the UN agencies. Let me underline that, specifically with IOM and HCR. I would like to highlight this excellent cooperation specifically in Niger, where we have been able to set a multi-sectoral approach with all the UN agencies on the ground, with IOM and UNHCR playing a central role of our comprehensive strategy targeted to support the local authorities and provide assistance to migrants. Let me also remind that the Migration Fund has also immediately been employed to address the crisis in Afghanistan in partnership with IOM, with a specific strategy meant to support countries bordering Afghanistan to manage the increasing flows of Afghan citizens. And new projects in Pakistan and Iran will be carried out next year. So this effort to support most vulnerable ones is as part of a structural policy that we carry out, and is equally well represented by an old Italian experience, the opening of legal and safe pathways, you mentioned before, the so-called humanitarian corridors. So humanitarian corridors are organized in partnership with IOM and HCR and civil society organizations. And since 2015, Italy has successfully carried out humanitarian corridors to benefit of people in need of international protection, especially children and women, from Lebanon, Jordan, Ethiopia, Niger, more recently from Libya, and finally from Afghanistan, as a new protocol we just signed a few weeks ago establishes. Through these channels has been offered a valid solution to around 3,000 refugees. The number of beneficiaries is further increasing as we are activating the new corridor mentioned before, to the benefit of 1,200 Afghan citizens. stranded in Iran and Pakistan. The new European Pact for Migration and Asylum should become the opportunity to transfer at the European level a multi-level approach based on responsibility and solidarity, to build a European framework of cooperation and promote regular migration. So it is important to set up new and efficient procedures to improve safe and regular migration while preventing human trafficking. Most of all, not to be overwhelmed by the emergency. Of course, there's a lot more that can be done. Stronger partnership between Europe and Africa is needed, for instance, and we are firmly pushing in that direction in our negotiations in Brussels. So thanks again. I know my time is expired. Thanks again for having me at this forum. It's a brilliant idea, and I wish all the best to this edition of the Rome Dialogues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this, Mr. Director Crudele. And so without further ado, let me give the floor to Mr. Hart, Director.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Matteo, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, to those who are present in this room and also to those who are connected virtually. First, allow me to say, to thank ISPI for this partnership in getting together and having this special room and for discussion on a topic such as migration, which often just hits the headlines when a tragedy occurs. Reality is indeed harsh for those seeking protection and cannot be overlooked. At the same time, aside the noisy collapse of many trees, we have a growing forest of many initiatives. And I'm really glad to see people, when reading the list of participants, of people who are coming from different walks of life and can actually enable us to have a conversation addressing the many issues, the positive and the negatives, of migration. And therefore, this is really, I think, a very important opportunity to come to an educated discussion. Let me just say that, for example, I was reading before coming here an analysis that has recently been made, for example, on the economic impact of migration in Italy. It is quite interesting to read that migrants in 2020 have contributed to 9.5% of the national GDP. In some regions, such as Lombardy, for example, migrants contribute up to 12% of the national GDP. Also, another point of note is that when you put costs and benefits, income and expenditures, the net positive for the Italian economy is 0.6 billion euro in 2020, against a cost of 25.5 billion euro. The net income for the government, for the state, was 26.1 billion euro. I think this is very important because it really helps us to see that there is an interest. Oftentimes when we speak about migration, there's a lot of statements saying it's not in my interest. And I think we have to see that there is an interest, even an economic interest, when we talk about migration. Let me conclude by thanking also Director Crudele for his words. I do want to and wish to stress the valid and the very fruitful collaboration with the Ministry and support by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to enhance the capacity of governments in transit and countries of origin when it comes to managing migration, but also for supporting life-saving operations such as the one in Afghanistan and neighboring countries, as well as, for example, in Libya. Without further ado, I don't want to take too much time because I think this is a golden opportunity for all of you to contribute. So I will give the floor again to Matteo for the program. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. Thank you, directors. Thank you for these welcome remarks. And so let me start by saying, the two calls for dialogue and cooperation clearly fit very well in the agenda of this forum because we will start from migration and development. And so before giving the floor to the speakers, let me give you a sense of what we're talking by bringing in you. Given that we didn't have, enough contacts, we are not going to have a lot of contacts and being able to network, we thought with IOM to do this kind of expert survey, which is clearly something that's going to remain in this room because we just involved you, and 22 of you responded, which is more than we are in this room right now. And clearly for those joining us online. So don't take this as any representative survey apart from the fact that it quite closely represents the views of this room. So let me kick off by giving you just a few insights, brief insights into the survey, starting from the most obvious one, which is we asked you why do people migrate within the Mediterranean region, and we clearly got what we expected in terms of what you expect. Don't take this, you won't see the index down there because it's just, we ask you to rank the questions and just take the relative positions to give you a sense of how far apart or close the answers were. But you ranked first for most of the time, so lack of socioeconomic perspectives, and then persecution and conflict came second. And as you can see also, quite interestingly, not the first time, I know another Euromed survey a few months ago found the same. The impact of climate changes comes last in terms of what we identify as causes. Clearly, this in some cases interacts with other causes, right? It might be lack of socioeconomic opportunities are affected by climate change, but it's interesting how we as experts, mainly from the north, from the Mediterranean, but also from the south, the Mediterranean, see this. But I think the most interesting results are here. You will see three pie charts. One is what do you expect to happen in terms of flows within the Mediterranean region, not just irregular, just migration flows within the Mediterranean region and through the Mediterranean region. And this is, again, expected. Most of you, there were 5 options, just 3 of them were selected. Most of you expect them to increase, and actually half of you expect them to increase significantly over the next years. But again, just to launch this session on migration and development, I think that there are some striking results, expected results here. Do you think immigration has a positive or negative impact on the development of destination countries? And in here, the answers were, I guess, again, as expected by experts. You find, overwhelmingly, we say positive, even though half of us say slightly positive. There is also 20%, a fifth of us, who says neutral effects on the development of destination countries. But again, this goes in the direction that we usually expect. I think that's what's really most interesting and what is really, it can feed into the debate is this slide. When we change the perspective from the perspective, again, of origin countries, the picture is much more mixed. Again, there is a prevalence of expected positive outcomes, but some of you, when you do the math and when you think about what does migration contribute to the development of origin countries, some of you actually selected slightly negative or even overwhelmingly negative. So again, it's a small sample, but I think it really begs the question of how is migration expected to contribute for the future of development of, bilaterally, and that's possibly one of the things that we might want to focus on after the kickoff speeches. So again, this is how it works. We have around 40 minutes. I hope that we make it for this session. And we have about 8 minutes for 2 speakers who are going to join us right now and pitch something to you. And then we're going to have a discussion, a general discussion with you. So for all of you, if you want to come in and discuss, just raise your name and I'll take note. And for those of you who are online, just raise your hand and somebody, I'm sure, will tell me. So again, let me go to Marta Foresti, Executive Director at ODI Europe. So Marta, what do you think about this, and how does migration contribute to the development of origin and destination countries, and what can we do maybe to make it even better and find these double, triple wins?
Thank you, Matteo. Thanks, everyone. It is indeed a joy to be back in a room and have a conversation. So with that in mind, I think I'll use this 7 to 8 minutes to ruffle some feathers, or at least to try to persuade you to come along with me on a journey that starts with a provocation, perhaps, which is that we really ought to stop talking about migration and sustainable development. Let me tell you what I mean by that. The fact that there is a relationship between the two, the fact that migration potentially, moving from one place to the other, moving across borders, moving to cities, is potentially a driver and an engine for sustainable development, is well established. In the literature, there are lots of debates about how that happens, what are the conditions for that to be maximized, for the impact to be maximized, but we know that the potential is there. So clearly this is a matter of changing the way we work, the way we do things, to allow that potential to be fulfilled. And to do that, we need to move on from a series of practices or boundaries that we got used to when it comes to migration and development. First, let's bag some victories or something we can rely on. I think we can successfully say and sort of pat ourselves on the shoulders that with both the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 and then with the Global Compact on Migration in 2018, we have successfully embedded the notion that migration is part of sustainable development, and sustainable development is very much a framing concept and a framing language around the Global Compact for Migration. So we can tick those boxes. We've got the global frameworks and to some extent some kind of consensus at the global level that there is in fact a potential to be fulfilled. However, my thoughts is that from, say, 2015-18 up to today, if you look at the way in which migration policies and then the work, the effort around sustainable development have evolved, have not made much progress in terms of making the most of that opportunity and that potential. I think if you look at the status of the migration debate in Europe and what's happening with migration policies in Europe, I think one could argue that we are very much still in a world where crises and emergencies lead the political and the public narratives, and where overwhelmingly borders management and borders control continue to dominate the priorities of what migration policies deal with. On the other hand, on sustainable development, much has happened. At the moment, there is a very strong focus on climate and on dealing with the climate crisis. And again, migration and climate have come together. There's been quite a lot of discussion about the implications that climate change has for migration. But again, my feeling is that we are sliding back to what we've seen before. So we are sliding back of using the emergency, the crisis narrative to lead the debate on migration and sustainable development. Now, something very important has happened since 2015, which is, of course, COVID. And that's where I personally see some movement, which I think you can perhaps more evidently than anywhere else spot in the new programs of the new coalition government in Germany, where the idea that migrant workers are essential contributors to our societies and economies is now become part of the way immigration policies are being thought of. Some of you might have spotted that Japan, of all places, is relaxing some of its immigration rules to allow more workers to contribute to the economic recovery. So I think COVID has taught us that indeed when necessities hit at the door, we are able to take action and do different things when it comes to migration and development. But who should do this? And this is my proposal. So my task today is to come to you with a pitch. And the pitch is that we cannot leave this to nation states, and particularly to the very nation states whose primary priority when it comes to migration policies is the safeguarding of borders, because the conflict around the necessity to prioritize that and the security challenges that that brings, I think you see it in the country where I live, in the UK, are so overwhelming in the logic of national politics that I do not think that what we've seen in Germany is likely to be replicated easily in many other national contexts. So we need to find other allies, we need to find other ways of doing things. And partly as a result of my slight frustration with working with the international system of migration stock policies and sustainable development. Over the last couple of years, I had the joy and the privilege of working with 20 city mayors across Africa and Europe who have decided that they wanted to do something about the fact that in their cities, people move. People move to cities, people move away from cities, people move within cities, and in some cases, that process of rapid urbanization can be overwhelming and can be a fundamental variable that determines the outcome, the potential positive outcomes of sustainable urban development. If I can have my first picture, it's probably not the first, but the second. I think the first is a title, if it's there. If not, I can continue without. The first reflection on working on cities is that mayors, as political actors, put their face to this effort. So the idea of doing something about the fact that their cities need to cope with rapid population change is something that they have to live day in and day out. They're not concerned with migration policies. They are very clear that it's not for them to decide who gets to come in or be accepted in a country or not, or necessarily to regulate the governance of migration. But the handling of human mobility and the fact that people move is very much at the heart of what cities are about. So I was going to show you a picture of two mayors, which are the mayors of Milan and the mayor of Freetown, that have taken the leadership in this effort and have created these platforms of roughly 20 cities on the two continents. What they're doing, they're not doing migration policies, they're doing waste management. Milan and Freetown are working together in the fashion industry to try to create concrete opportunity for skills exchange and investment in the textile industry across the two countries. Cities of Dakar and Barcelona are working together on the fishing industry in Dakar and some of the challenges of illegal migration or using the fishing industry and the vessels to facilitate dangerous journeys, and with the Diaspora in Barcelona trying to revert that and look at opportunities for jobs creation in the sector. And more than anything else, what the cities are doing together are discussing and creating opportunities for jobs creation, for opportunities for economic development and opportunities for the people who move to cities, because fundamentally cities is where opportunities are to be found. But perhaps the most interesting thing about what's happening in this work, and there is, I encourage you, I don't have the time now to go and have a look at the details. This platform is called the Mayor's Dialogue on Growth and Solidarity, and you can find a lot of details of what's happening there. But perhaps what's most interesting about this, and this is actually a political proposition, is that having come together, realizing the fact that cities across the two continents have a common set of challenges and opportunities around the realities of human mobility, of course the conversation has very quickly moved on to what these cities can and should be doing together in a range of different areas, and particularly in what are today the most striking and urgent matters that affect human lives. First and foremost, the pandemic, and secondly, climate change. So these mayors and the cities are wanting to have a say in the way in which the green and just transition will take place in both continents, with lots of challenges that also emerge after COP26 in terms of the inequality between the realities of these two continents when it comes to apply low carbon transitions. And then the pandemic. I found it inspiring that from the beginning of this process, the city of Milan, which was particularly badly hit by COVID-19, took the leadership and pushed this process through. Fast forward 2 years, I was in Milan yesterday because the same two mayors who came together to take action on human mobility have now written a statement on vaccine equity and highlighting the problem with profound inequalities on the access to vaccines and the systems to distribute vaccine and the IP that is required to produce vaccines. And with the other fellows, African and European mayors, are calling for action and coming together on what is a genuine partnership of equal to demand change. And you see how the cities coming together about the reality of migration and sustainable development have created a partnership and a platform to work more across some of the most urgent, tangible challenges that determine the profound inequalities between these two continents. I think that's good. I think that bringing human mobility as part of a debate that is about all of us human beings, and what the challenges are that, for our collective future, marks a substantive step forward in changing the narrative away from, as we said at the beginning from this session, away from crisis and emergencies, to actually give meaning to the idea of what can be done to move forward and to move ahead with dealing with the fact that people move, have always moved, and will continue to move, and a number of them will most likely continue to move to cities, as I think 2/3 of the world population will live in some of the largest cities by 2050. So here's my pitch. Pay attention to cities, and for that matter, to all other local decision makers, as political actors that can actually help us take some step forwards in changing the narrative, which maybe like me, you find a bit frustrating to call for without a sense on how to go about it. And mayors have some thoughts. So here's my pitch.
Thank you, Marta. I guess that the Mayors Migration Council is, to me, an excellent initiative to start, again, thinking locally and acting locally for migration. And again, obviously, when you talk about cities, you talk about an overwhelming majority of migrants as well, both internally.
Can I just clarify one thing? The Mayors Migration Council is a global initiative of mayors that focuses on migration. What is interesting about this initiative on Africa and Europe is that it stems from it to create something which is specifically acting in the geopolitical space of Africa and Europe, and in many ways going beyond the boundaries of migration policy, which is what I was trying to highlight as being concretely my pitch, that you can really begin to move forwards when you place that conversation into real geographical spaces where change is needed.
Thank you. And thank you for making it as a conversation. It's much appreciated. So let me give the floor again to the second speaker, Ms. Marina Manke. She's Labor Mobility and Human. She comes from the Labor Mobility and Human Development Division in the Department of Migration Management at the IOM. So Ms. Manke, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Welcome to everyone. I'm so thrilled to be together at the Migration Forum. Thank you, Director Crudele and Lawrence, for the opening, and Marta for your also insightful thoughts. It's always easy to go second, because a lot of, or even fourth, to be honest, because a lot of messages very important ones have already been said. Let me just also, since I have very few minutes to share some ideas from my end, and also not only talking personally as an expert who has been working on migration for more than 20 years, but also share with you some ideas that we have and important initiatives which we believe will be relevant and quite novel looking in 2022. So my pitch would be to really unite our efforts together and support our work towards International Migration Forum Review 2022 in May, because that's a unique opportunity for us to tackle this tilted narrative on migration and human mobility, which I agree, unfortunately, needs more work from our end. But already this forum, which is taking place within a broader dialogue within the Mediterranean region, is a great contribution to fixing that imbalanced narrative. Because, of course, when we start speaking about human mobility in the context of broader societal transformations and transition, this is definitely helping us to really get to those concrete, specific constellations between human mobility and specific areas, like Marta spoke about the local level partnership with mayors, which is absolutely crucial. We know what was happening in some countries where, when the national governance institutions were going into the right direction, it was the local level authorities who were picking up and really advocating for the importance of human mobility and the contributions of migrants on the ground in their communities and their villages. So I think from my end, what I would like to just say a few things, 5 priorities, 5 initiatives, which I believe would be of relevance for all of us when we start bringing that dialogue and discourse between migration and human mobility into a more nuanced manner, because again, our organization has progressed in formulating what we mean under the linkages between migration and sustainable development. We adopted the strategy, institutional strategy, and I'm grateful for Marta's and the Institute's team for helping us, for inspiring us in formulating what we mean within our institution organization on this nexus between migration and sustainable development. And interestingly, the three outcomes which we are envisaging, they are all about the situation of migrants. And the dominant theme for us moving forward would be not only to work in partnership with local authorities across countries. We also have been advocating and progressing a lot for the importance of working with the private sector, the sector who is actually the stakeholder who is giving jobs to migrants, the stakeholder who is mediating jobs, either in a bona fide manner, or really charging fees to help migrants or to assist migrants to get to their dreamed job location. So, but also what is important for us when we Zoom is also to strengthen focus on the migrants themselves, migrant voice. And the three outcomes which we envisage in our work on migration and sustainable development include the following. One is we look at migration, we are aspiring for migration to increasingly becoming a choice. So not a forceful push factor, which is really driving migrants out of their locations where they reside, but really that is increasingly becoming a choice. The second outcome, which we are aspiring to achieve together with in partnership with other stakeholders, is that migrants are empowered. The empowerment of migrants is something what we really strongly believe, that they are not just victims or vulnerable migrants, but also they are empowered and they're agents of the change themselves. And the third focus, of course, is good governance. That's what our organization is all about. So the 5 priorities I promised to you to speak about today are as follows. The first one, yes, I see the importance of moving migration to more closer development discourse and discussions. But I can be honest with all of you that for me, an expert who has always dominantly been working in the contexts which are more stable, more developed, I think we still need to do more work on bringing and strengthening this interrelationship between development, humanitarian dimension, and of course peace. The HDPN, the nexus, is something which is becoming very important in our work when we also offer for development outcomes. Concretely, in our response to Afghanistan, which is a pure humanitarian response, we are advocating for the importance of also envisaging some really development disruptions which the crisis currently is bringing to communities and migrants and their families. So how do we tap into this nexus? How do we operationalize that? One instrument we are finalizing is the so-called driver diagnostic. We want to be able to better explain the situation of a specific community or a country in terms of what is actually driving migrants. And this is a constellation of positive and negative factors. So we are progressing on that. There are already surveys being carried out in some countries and also in the regional context, in particular in Latin America. The second initiative and the area of work which we are going to focus on is the skills dimension, bringing the skills solidly into our responses and marrying education policies and migration policies, but also labor market inclusion policies. I'm sure my colleague Herta is going to focus on the skills mobility partnerships later in the regular pathway, so I'll spare you from my talk on that, but that's certainly the priority, and I believe by bringing skills into migration responses, we really are becoming closer to the private sector. We start looking to situation of specific industries, and of course, migrants' employment primarily in sectors like agriculture, also hospitality, is pointing us to the direction of which type of support training programs we need to focus on in the future. The third area related to migration and sustainable will remain for us, of course, stronger responses in the context of social inclusion, integration, and social cohesion. Here too, we are progressing. A latest development from our end is our approach on social mixing, because we want to really be credibly capable of looking into the situation and the impact of our interventions. So we are designing the monitoring evaluation framework to look into our programming, and this is going to be also available in 2022 for discussions and, of course, inputs. In the context of integration, the work on self-employment and entrepreneurship for our policy guide with UNCTAD and UNHCR will continue, and we also are embracing collaboration with specialized agencies and partners in the area of assisting migrants to become entrepreneurs, accessing financial capital, and also developing their transnational entrepreneurial networks and value chains. The fourth point I wanted to speak about, the priority which is emerging for us, which is not new, it's the intersection between migration and trade. It has been there. We had an event on that in multiple fora over last few years, but also starting from 2002. What COVID has showed to us is the importance of looking into the impact of disruptions of border closures on the cross-border traders. And in Africa, for instance, in South Africa, we came up with an article, and we are going to really initiate few projects where we will look into the impact of cross-border trading and human mobility, and how we can empower the population involved in those processes. And the last but not least is, of course, as I mentioned already, focus on migrants and working with migrant organizations. I'm, of course, going to mention our collaboration with diaspora communities. This too needs a little bit of a revamping, because we preach about migration and diaspora engagement already for many, many years and decades. But how do we really empower the communities so they become equal partners in our dialogue? So I want to give a bit of a head start to the event, the Global Diaspora Week, which is starting on the 12th of December. This is organized by the Global Diaspora Confederation, which was a follow-up structure which emerged in our collaboration and discussions with diaspora communities. So happy to provide more information on that. And also as another semi-formal announcement about our work with the government of Ireland on the organization of Global Diaspora Summit in April as a contribution to the International Migration Forum review. So closing on the International Migration Forum review once again, from which I started, I think, again, let's ensure that moving forward, we try to use each opportunity, each forum, each event, going towards May, that we mobilize our voice and it becomes stronger. And we are not only speaking about general issues, but also going into specifics, nitty-gritty examples where we see the intersection between migration and development really becoming a change maker on a concrete situation of a concrete migrant. I'll stop here. Over.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bernanke. Thank you, Marina, thank you both speakers for sticking to their allotted time, because now we can open the floor to discussion. We have about 20 minutes to do so. And so I would ask you to raise your name if you want to intervene. And given that I don't see anyone right now, let me prod you. Okay, Alessandra, let me just prod you anyway and ask, because I think this is something that should be discussed, and maybe many of you can come in. Why is it that, for instance, we, in our own survey, find that, for instance, migration and the effect on development on origin countries can be negative and or even overwhelmingly negative? And what can we do to change that? Is it a matter of perception? Is it a matter of facts? And what are the challenges? And what can we change about it? Clearly, the pitch from Marta looks into the direction, even though she started by saying that she doesn't see clearly a discrepancy between migration and development. But I think it speaks to all of us as experts to ask ourselves, is there some truth there, and what is this? So please, Ms. Venturini, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. The debate was very interesting, and I would like more to, you see, your question is challenging. We know as researchers that we can have negative effect of migration in the sending country, at least more people that want to move. But I want just to raise a question to the previous speaker. What can be done? There are a lot of private investment in Africa, a lot of benevolent associations work in this country. What we can do to make their intervention be more coherent with the long-run development of this area? Is there a possibility? I know that Europe is trying to coordinate. There is Ariadne, who is the foundation of non-banking institutions. Why don't we put them on a table to help to have a united project? It will be an improvement, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Venturini. Let me also take another intervention from Julien Simon online, and let me remind you, you can also intervene if you want. You have about 3 or 4 minutes if you want. So, no, let me take the online first. So, Julien, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Matteo. Can you hear me well? Yes?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Good. So the hybrid continuing. Sorry, I cannot be with you today. I'm on quarantine. It happens. And I will have to be like this for the coming 10 days. But I'm glad to participate, and I'm thankful for the invitation. I just wanted to perhaps, I'm not reacting to your question, to be honest with you, because I had raised my hand before that, so sorry about that. But I wanted to focus on one of the points which has been brought up in the concept note with regard to this event, and notably the strengthening of collaborative migration governance, and also reacting to the comments on how to move forward and then be as concrete as possible. For me, this is a very, very important issue, particularly in the Euro-Mediterranean region, because at the end of the day, we can benefit from the momentum which could be generated by the new agenda for the Mediterranean, which was communicated earlier in 2021, and the call for renewing migration partnerships. We've seen over the last year a lot of discussions taking place on revitalizing, re-energizing, reimagining, and so on and so forth. And I think that we all owe to everyone to contribute to bringing perhaps specific elements, specific aspects, which would help us to be more concrete in this approach. In ICMPD, for the Mediterranean region, what we have decided to do is to reshape our approach so as to focus particularly on capacities. We have a capacity-centered approach to migration partnerships, which addresses the various stakeholders who are involved in governing migration at multiple levels. For that, we need to also change the approach when it comes to the reality of political agenda gaps which exist between Europe and their partners in the southern neighborhood, for instance. These often diverging political agendas are not very much bridged. And the fact is that they do not match, or they do not pass the test, so to say, of reality when it comes to the expectations that they raise on both sides. And I think this is something that we need to truly integrate in the way we try to revitalize these migration partnerships to bring them to deliver concrete results. So for that, we have decided to focus particularly our approach on capacities, and to also invite our partners to think beyond the traditional thematic labels that have been used, not to undermine their importance, but to also add to that the labels such as asylum and international protection, migration and development, we're talking about sustainable development, and so on and so forth, and to focus on cross-cutting capacity drivers that we are looking into, which are multi-level governance, professionalization, modernization, and communication. I think that Marta was mentioning the changing the narrative and so on and so forth. This is something that we have been working on for a number of years. And it's important for us to basically have a very pragmatic approach to these migration partnerships, including this issue of communication migration, to actually create a common ground between all these partners. Because at the end of the day, we need to try to reconcile these expectations, which are often totally mismatched. But I will not go beyond that, but I'm very, very much interested to continue the discussions today. Thank you very much, Matteo.
Thank you so much, Simone, and thank you for being brief to the point and absolutely provocative in this attempt to bring us to bring some cross-cutting issues to the fore. Let me give the floor to Filippo Di Robilant as the third speaker, and then I'll let Marta, and maybe if also Marina wants to reply, I'll let them, and then we'll take the second round of questions. So Filippo Di Robilant, yes. President of the Italian Foundation for the United World Colleges.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Now, may I start by saying that exclusion is costly, inclusion pays off for everyone. Who in their right mind, unless they're hypocrites, can deny that full inclusion of migrant communities in the welfare systems of hosting countries, as well as support for their economic potential, is not beneficial to countries both of origin and destination? So in that sense, I agree the narrative, we must really do a quality leap in the mainstream narrative. Now, I would like to highlight a few how would I say, way forwards. Given the time constraint, I will just indicate where to have a good look at them. And this is the recommendations that the Working Group on Migration of T20 recently made for the G20 summit that took place in October in Rome. There's a host of very good recommendations. They concern governments, but they also concern other players. As Marta Foresti said, local communities, mayors, governors. We have a number of experiences that time has shown us are positive. Shelter city experience in America, human rights cities in Europe. And I agree, mayors, governors are local decision makers. But however, they do not take part in the national decision making process, let alone the international one. This is one of the reasons why local administrators have organized themselves in networks, thematic networks, in order to have an impact, and this notwithstanding whatever the position of their national governments are. So this is something that should be valued. One of the things that that is suggested in this in the T20 recommendation, and is closely connected to what I was just saying, is the role of return migrants networks and making them a building block of the post-pandemic development strategies in the countries of origin. In light of the increasing return migration and the challenges posed by the disruption of supply chains due to the pandemic. In this sense, the work that we must do with the diaspora must really have a quality leap effected. So institutions should help mobilize the financial capital accumulated through remittance flows. Remittances haven't been used effectively up to now. It's private money. This is why it's important to dialogue with diasporas in order to make them more useful, especially back home. The human capital developed through experience and training abroad, and the social capital through kin networks in the countries of origin. So I really invite you to go and see these recommendations. Professor Venturini and Martin Roos were here, with my colleagues as co-chair, and so thank you very much for the moment.
Thank you so much. So before opening up the floor to the second round questions, Marta and Marina, do you want to reply? Maybe Marta first on investments and so on.
Yes, I'll take a couple. Some from Professor Venturini and others, and actually you, Matteo, on the challenge or the recognition that the relationship between migration and development is not always necessarily positive. Of course not. I actually think one of the many things that we need to change and overcome is this framing that we're a little bit stuck with, that not just in relation to development, but generally on migration debate, that we have camps, you're either for and against, is either positive or negative. The notion of a nexus is, of course, is the interdependence and the fact that the effect that moving from one place to another can have on development locally for communities of origins, the role of remittances, all of that needs to be taken into account. There is nothing inherent that makes it positive. That's why I referred to the opportunities and the potential that we know is there in terms of fiscal contribution to the fiscal balance, or maximizing income, or the potential of remittances. These are all opportunities that, like most development practice, needs to be turned into reality by the how. So it's how programs are designed, how people are able to move, how remittances flows and the cost of them can be reinvested back in the countries of origin. So I'm not surprised at all. I don't think it's just a perception. I think it is definitely the case that in some cases moving from one place to the other can have a negative effect for the countries and communities of origins, which is why there is so much thinking going, for example, into skills partnership and skills exchanges and initiatives that are designed precisely to balance the need and the potential of the different communities of origins and destination. On private investment, which I think is a very interesting question, and I think it is, I wish it was all private investment. I think you're right. We are seeing a lot of private money or initiatives that are almost like piling up a little bit or adding up in different contexts that are now labeled as interventions aimed at some kind of positive outcomes on migration, or sometimes also reducing migration. To some extent, the challenge is not dissimilar to one that we've seen in the past in development, where different actors and private actors think about when Gates came in with all his money to do immunization, and it took a while to get, to create coordination and in a way harmony in a moving, landscape of funders. But when it comes to migration, one thing we could really do is to shift the attention, or to recognize that there is one thing to do, which may well be interventions to support particularly vulnerable communities through private funding of different kinds, working with civil society. But then there is the private investment, and that's where a lot more could be done. For example, in the European African space, more with the development banks and the investment banks on the kind of investments that are needed, where skills development, where exchanges, where moving can be part of a forward-looking agenda, for example, to sustain a green and just transition. So if I think that coordination, perhaps not of all kinds of funding, but the ones that is specifically directed at creating opportunities for local economic development, in which the movement from one place to the other, whether it is across borders or not, is taken into account as a factor that can facilitate positive outcomes, is something that I think we haven't, there hasn't been enough discussions on, and again is one where cities are taking some leadership in terms of attracting private funders. And to finish with cities, yes, cities do not have a seat at the table, you're absolutely right. They're asking for it, so these African and European cities are quite explicitly asking, if not next year, maybe from next year, to be part of the national delegations, for example, in the AU summit, and they've done so with the international community at the UN level. This is, and that's important, is only part of the story, because I think there is also something quite distinct that cities and mayors can do to support the role of national governments in doing different things. So rather than have decisions on migration policy to make it a different...
Go to the point, sorry.
Yes, to make it a different proposition, so to try to handle the realities of population growth at the local level, rather than participate in migration policy making.
Sorry to cut you short, Marta. I just wanted to, again, open the floor, and we still have around 5 minutes. I think I'll steal a bit of time from the second session. And I have two speakers who wanted to come in. Amira Germasi, from head of the career centers in Tunis Business School. You have the floor. Please, if you can stick it to 3 minutes so that we can...
Sure. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me. So I'm from Tunisia. I am a university professor, and I was the former advisor to the Minister of Higher Education in charge of employability and the linkage between industry and university on the national level. And I work a lot on many projects, let's say, launched by IOM and other organizations, similar organizations. So I would like to come back to the low, let's say, economic perspective. So I would just take Tunisia as a showcase in terms of having, let's say, if there is the reason of the migration of our youth to Europe, it's these low, let's say, economic perspective caused by even low qualified or not qualified people. They are looking for Europe as an opportunity for them to get a better life standards, but also we have another problem, and which can be a paradox, which is overqualified people. And what we mean by overqualified is they are not really matching to the private sector growth. I mean, the business or the private sector growth is not in alignment with the education that we are giving. In terms that I will give you just a number. We have like the highest unemployment rate in biotech engineering, which it seems, I mean, really weird in terms if it's like an industry with a high potential in Europe, and in Tunisia we have the highest unemployed engineers. And so this is, we have to rethink in how to reskill these people, to give them the opportunities locally in their country. For the low and no qualified persons also, looking at Europe for the, let's say, the best opportunity, and they dream of going there to have a better life, is just to provide them with the skills needed also in their local market. Is it a negative impact? Yes. I mean, from Tunisia perspective, yes, because we have more than 36% of engineers leaving each year to Europe. We have more than 35% of doctors going to Europe. So we are really having like a brain drain from Tunisia to Europe, knowing that 90% of our education system is a state education, so it's for free. So this is really something is how we say that we are struggling with every day to maintain these people, to maintain these pool of talents in Tunisia. So this is how can I explain how long is this migration has a negative impact. And for the intervention of my neighbor here, so we had many programs dealing with the same, let's say, issue, the migration, and I noticed when I was in the government that there is no, let's say, good governance of all these projects, so many overlappings, many duplication, and not really, let's say, customized to the local needs of the country, maybe on the regional, let's say, view, but not locally. Once again, I think, if I can put this in one simple sentence, is really we need like upskilling people locally and reskilling them to be aligned to the local market needs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This opens up a lot of questions that will feed into the second session. I'm sure we will be talking about that. So let me now try to close this session. If Marina, again, she's online, she wants to just briefly comment for 1 minute as a closing, just raise your hand. Otherwise, we will go to the close. But anyway, Mr. Kolinka-Yeha, I hope that I pronounced it well, Dean of the Faculty of Education of University of Malta.
Thank you for the opportunity. I would like to just put two challenges in this discussion. One is a change of narrative, the use of crisis. And the use of crisis very often is adopted to show the crisis that a country experiences when there is an influx of very often irregular immigration. And I would like to propose this change of narrative in the sense that we look at narrative in the sense of the pain that brings these irregular immigrants to our countries, and to support these people to be able to be welcomed into the countries. Let's remember that research, even though in our small research it came second, but research is overwhelmingly saying that most of the people that leave their country of origin is because of persecution. And unfortunately, these people will go from persecution to other forms of persecution. The other point I would like to make is the right to move from one country of reception to another. And I'm saying this because I know, for example, in my home country, Malta, I know of a lot of workers who are working in Malta but have no protection, no health protection, no education, no rights for anything, because they happen to have Italian papers. They come from Italy and come to Malta because they can find work, especially in the building industry. I would like just to say one episode that happened recently in Malta exactly because of this. A worker fell one story, and the employer, the person who was the contractor that was employing him, he realized that this person is with Italian papers, so if he takes him to hospital, he will have to pay the full hospital bill. So he took him in his van, and he threw him on the road, not even on the pavement, on the road, so that anybody will think that he was run over by a car. And this and many other things are happening. I myself have accepted a student from Ghana, for example, who was in Italy with her parents to study. When we asked for her to be given free education, we can do that. They realized that she has Italian papers, so she cannot study in Malta. And obviously, we had to send her back, even though she was a very promising student.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your remarks. So it's my fault I didn't see another two speakers who wanted to join. So we agreed that before moving to the second session, I'll give 1 minute each to make their remarks. So Ms. Alvarez from the IOM Coordination Office for the Mediterranean, you have the floor.
Thank you, Matteo. I just wanted to build on what Marta was saying about perception, and I feel that another thing that we have to overcome to discuss about migration and development is the deeply rooted dichotomy in this discourse. Marta was highlighting the interdependency between migration and development, and the problem is that when we discuss this, normally partners are not perceived, or they don't perceive themselves to be on the same foot. So if we assume that the root causes of migration are located in geographies or societies that are different from ours, very far away, then that doesn't help. Or if we assume that countries are only sending migrants abroad or only receiving migrants, that doesn't help either. I think one of the things we have to look at is also policy coherence. And Marta was saying, okay, local authorities, they do not discuss about migration. They discuss about waste management, about fisheries, about sustainability. And I also feel that, yes, that's the way to go. Making sectoral policies more sensitive to migration issues and making migration policies more sensitive to development issues can help or can lead to that policy coherence. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola, for sticking to the allotted time. And let me close this session by giving the floor to Daniela Bernanke, Executive Director at the UN Global Compact Network for Italy.
Thank you, Matteo. Just two suggestions for the people here today. The first one is that it's true there are many people overqualified that are here in Italy as migrants, and they are working in a very simpler and poor condition. One issue is that our bureaucracy needed to go through a streamline in the process of recognizing the top quality level of education some migrants have, because if not, they will never find a job properly to the preparation they do have. So one issue is work with university and with the administration in order to have their degree recognized. The other issue is the task we work with companies that the private sector has in the inclusion of migrants people. And of course it's a responsibility, and I understand many companies have a cultural I would say, approach that is not very open, but there is also the cost of the inclusion. We did a research on our companies, and the main issues were languages constraints, so they have to invest a lot in order that they could teach Italian to people, but also the lack of fiscal advantages in hiring these migrants. So I think one of the issues is cultural, as I said, but there is also the lack from the states of investing in the cohesion and inclusion of these people. And it's a real pity, because with all these competencies built, we could also answer to the question Matteo was saying of the negative impact in the origin country. Well, it's not true. If we create competency and we give a push to the circular migration of competency, then the origin country can also benefit from these people maybe going back for work, or also sharing their competencies. We have a lot of small entrepreneurs here that are investing in their origin country because they built their competency here. So this is an issue that goes far beyond remittance. It's a migration of knowledge, I would say.
Thank you, thank you. This links clearly closely to the second session, so this leads us to this. But let me first give you some logistical notes. I didn't tell you beforehand, but I must apologize, we're not going to have a coffee break. Due to COVID reasons, we cannot really leave the room until we go to lunch, but I promise you we will go to lunch, okay? So afterwards, I give you direction for that. And I know that you're all upset about this, but I'm sorry, but that's the rules that we have to follow. So again, I think we managed to almost stay within the time allotted, and so I'm quite glad. If we can move to the second slide, right? So let me start again by giving you just again a few insights of what you told us on legal channels of migration. So let's skip the first slide, which was about what affects migrants choosing regular and irregular channels, but let's see. Again, somebody was talking about the fact, possibly Marta, but I think we all acknowledge this. The problem with migration governments, but also with migration policies in general, is that we are very focused on short-term reactive policies. And clearly, again, we are constantly focusing on irregular movements and border management, which doesn't mean that it's not an issue, but we tend to skip a lot of other absolutely important parts. Filippo Di Robiland was talking about earlier, for instance. And that's the case. So we ask you this: what do you expect migration policies of destination countries, made in destination countries in the Mediterranean, to become in the future? Will they become more restrictive or more open over the next decade? And you, as a group, expected them to become a bit more open for students and entrepreneurs. a bit more restrictive for family members. I think Professor Venturini, if I'm not mistaken, you were talking about also reunification, and that's an interesting trend, also an issue. And for workers, overall, we expect the trend just to become a bit more liberal, but not much. And that might be an issue. Ms. Ganassi was actually talking about the brain drain issue. But again, linking the two together, we asked you, which of these policies on legal channels should be prioritized? And you all went with the issue of the moment, clearly, talent partnerships, which is the subject of a European Commission proposal this June, if I'm not mistaken. And it clearly overranked all the others. You all say they're all important, but it clearly overranked all the others. Then we see visa liberalization schemes, seasonal migration programs, labor migration quotas, and so on. And just to close this introduction, the final question was, what are the key determinants of success in skills mobility partnership schemes, so talent partnerships as well? And you said engagement of the private sector as first thing, and then matching of skills needs between partner countries. Again, it might be worth noting, even the matching of skills needs over time in order to foster sometimes circular migration for somebody who wants to come back home and feed it back and not just become a drain on the process. But it's, I think to me, it gives us a neat context for this session. So yes, we need more cooperation between countries. Talent partnerships, for those of you who are not aware, is simply trying to finance schemes that train people for vocational training and training in the countries of origin before departure, and then trying to open up a part at least of these trained people for legal channels for them to reach Europe. And so again, I think this connects with the first speaker of the second session. I'll go with Mattia Di Salvo. He's a researcher at the Center for European Policy Studies in Belgium. And so, Mattia, you have the floor. And if you can upload the next slides.
Thank you very much, Matteo. And I also want to thank ISPI and IOM to organize this conference. Actually, yes, it very links well with the discussion on talent partnership. So today I will try to go through some observation on why a focus on skills and training can actually represent a way forward in migration policies of the EU, and especially in relation with the Mediterranean region. So different already important elements have been raised today. So also the main question from Matteo, why indeed migration can sometimes be not beneficial for the development of origin countries, in my opinion, is because the right incentives have not been created before for origin countries to really cooperate and getting on board on migration schemes, and also not concrete opportunity and valid alternatives for people across different skills levels have been created in order to, let's say, curb irregular migration. So the main idea of the talent partnership is to try to exploit shared needs between country of origin and destination, and to leverage on the difference in training cost to indeed foster human capital development. So this is the key aspect, and let's say drives upon the global skill partnership model. And the idea is that by training more people than, let's say, permits available under specific schemes, one can increase labor market outcomes of workers both in the origin country and in the destination countries. So in this sense, such a scheme, migration schemes that covers also human capital development can create the right incentives for origin countries to cooperate, but most importantly to involve the private sectors. So companies at origin and destination will be able, after the training is complete, to hire workers with the skills and competencies they are looking for in the labor market. So the dual track approach proposed by the Global Skill Partnership model define training that's common to all the workers per departure, and then of course people moving in the destination countries can also undergo two specific trainings which can be tailored to the country of destination, so in terms of language, but also more specific requirement at occupational level. Beside the direct effect in terms of employability, such an approach can also help, let's say, harmonize the definition of skills and recognition, and also of prior learning that in country of destination of origin is very important. And also there will be an investment in training capacity in country of origin, so going beyond the simple mobility aspect and try to invest much more on human capital development. Moving away from a pure sectoral approach based on wide quotas, a focus on skills can of course also increase, let's say, the flexibility of future migration schemes. So first of all, skills can be beneficial to different industries, and it would be also possible to increased possibility for regional migration between different origin countries. There are already different projects like Match from IOM that involves several destination and origin countries. Looking more at the longer term perspective and considering the emerging needs driven by global transitions such as the green and digital, trying to interlink migration with human capital development can even make more sense because it will be possible to monitor emerging skills needs, implementing skills assessment and anticipation mechanisms in both countries, and therefore up and reskilling activities can be implemented also by looking at competencies that are necessary for the green transition. So in key sectors like agriculture and construction, for which we know there is a significant need for up and reskilling to face the green transition, there could be opportunity for also mobility to the EU. Employer association in both sectors faced constantly shortages to fill in, and this is not only limited to, let's say, the short-term needs, but also more medium to long-term needs in the EU. As you can see, job openings by 2030 are not only clustered to highly skilled occupation. The fourth category is elementary workers. So even though there will not be significant amount of new job created in this occupation, replacement needs are significant. At the same time, in country in the southern Mediterranean, low to medium skill occupations such as elementary workers, agricultural workers, or craft-related workers represent a significant share in the labor force, and therefore up and reskilling activity will be necessary anyway, and could indeed embed skills and competencies relevant for the future in terms of green transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mattia. Thank you so much for this interesting presentation and for sticking to the time allotted. So let me move very, very fast to Mr. Sabelo Mokazi, Head of Labor, Employment and Migration Division at the African Union Commission. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Since maybe I'm the sixth speaker, I will stand on the protocol that has already been established. So I would like to thank you for inviting the African Union Commission. We would like to also appreciate the opportunity and also and congratulate you for recognizing that the migration is actually an international or global phenomenon that requires a multi-sectoral or geopolitical response. I want to appreciate the great points that have been made by colleagues, but in our opening statement, we would like to observe and underscore that migration is a developmental issue that, if well managed, can yield extraordinary benefits both in the sending countries and also in the countries of destination. We also know that migration is not a problem to solve, but an opportunity to harness. We also know that African migration is predominantly intracontinental, almost 80% is within the continent. But we also acknowledge that Europe is a top destination for African outbound migrants. But then what is African Union doing to contribute to the subject that is being discussed today, especially the issue of migration, strengthening migration or regular migration pathways? AU in 2018 adopted the migration policy framework for Africa in 2018 that focuses on 8 pillars: the migration governance, labor migration and education, diaspora engagement, border governance, irregular migration, forced displacement, internal migration, and migration and trade. We focus on these areas. So these areas are also then assist the African Union to build the capacity of member states on migration management. We also would like to contribute to this forum that the issue of migration policy processes and dialogue architecture. Do we have the political will to deal with these issues? We've heard in many meetings that there's no political will, and the policy discourse is not moving up the hierarchy for better decision making. But we do have a biennial ministerial meeting for ministers that are responsible for migration and ministers of foreign affairs. But also annually, the ministers of foreign affairs, they meet the EU ministers of foreign affairs in a platform called Executive Council, where they take various decisions, including decisions on migration. Annual heads of state, also that is another opportunity. So the architecture is great, and I think there's an opportunity to improve the narrative on migration, especially the issue of regular migration pathways. What is it that is available that AU has put in place with regards to migration dialogues and cooperation? Yes, there's cooperation. We have a Continental Pan-African Forum for migration, where we bring together all parties, all role players in the migration, but we also have EU-AU Migration and Mobility Dialogue, which is usually known as MMD. This is the platform where we have prioritized mainly 3 areas. We've prioritized the issue of diaspora engagement and issues of remittances. And the second one, we've prioritized information and intelligence sharing. And the third one is to look at issues of return, readmission and reintegration. That is what AU at a continent-to-continent level these are the policy or thematic areas that we are discussing. But also AU participate on what is known as Khartoum process, which involves EU and AU focusing on the Horn of Africa, but also Rabat process, which is the West Africa route, to analyze the West Africa route and come up with better policy propositions. But AU also has its own initiative, which is called AU Horn of Africa Initiative, where is an opportunity also to discuss issues of legal pathways or regular pathways. Maybe let me turn on to Just one example, I have two examples that I can share with this forum. The example of policy intervention. Recently, between AU and AU, we commissioned a study on return, readmission, and integration. So this is another good example that shows the area of collaboration in order to further explore areas of common interest. But then I also want to share with you that with regards to Mediterranean and the Mediterranean route, but also with regards to the Libya situation or unstable situation, which has seen a number of irregular migration happening there. In 2017, the AU Abidjan Summit decided to establish AU, EU, and UN tripartite task force for stranded migrants and refugees in Libya, with the responsibility to save lives and to provide international protection and to enhance and accelerate assisted voluntary return efforts. But then, what is it that this has achieved? This tripartite platform, which includes AU, EU, and UN tripartite task force, to date has assisted about 50,000 migrants that were stranded in Libya and helped them to go back home. Another good example that I needed to share with this platform is that AU is actually operationalizing 3 centers on migration so that we can improve data, so that the policies can be driven by evidence. One of the migration centers is Africa Center for the Study on Research and Migration in Mali, in Bamako. Another one is African Migration Observatory, which is in Rabat, in Morocco. The third one is Continental Operational Center. These are the migration centers that will study the actual trends on the ground, but they've been given, idiosyncratic kind of responsibilities so that you can inform migration policy at AU. And then we hope that with the evidence, we can be able to formulate better or responsive policies on the ground. Let me close by indicating that as AU, we will be developing the return, reintegration, or readmission guidelines policy, which will also assist member states to be able, at the national level, to deal with the legal or regular migration pathways and what to do if the migrants are returning to the country, and understand the whole discussion on return and integration. So these are the policy action that will be pushing at African Union, but also the intra-regional migration and mobility and trade. This is what, through the platform, the Continental Free Movement Agenda and then CFTA. So I would like to close by saying we continue to work with all the partners, but also the EU, to be able to move forward, to change the narrative, so that it's a developmental narrative and forecast migration discourse. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bokazi. And I'll give you the floor to Ms. Gertrude Lanneux, Senior Regional Labour Mobility and Human Development Specialist at the IOM. If we manage to stick to the 8 minutes, then we will have 20 minutes for the discussion before breaking for lunch.
I will do my best, and please do stop me if I run over time. It's a real pleasure to be here today. My name is Geertra, and I work for IOM as a Labour Mobility and Human Development Specialist. The discussions so far, I think, have been really interesting, and as we heard this morning, migration can have a positive impact on development, but this is not automatic. This is something we really have to work towards, and for this we have to make sure that we have well-managed, regular migration. Unfortunately, that's not always the case today. So far, a lot of the migration is still happening through irregular ways. Migrants face lots of risks during the journeys. They face risk also when they arrive. Cases of exploitation, we already heard examples like in Malta. Unfortunately, this still happens. This is rampant, and it's hard to say how such forms of migration would actually contribute to development or contribute to the human rights protection of migrants themselves. So in my point of view, there is a real effort to be done jointly to promote regular, well-managed pathways to Europe. And this so far hasn't been, let's say, in the focus of the attention. A lot of work has been done on, border management, return, basically even, questions on how can we prevent migration to Europe. Little work has been done in terms of thinking how can we better manage migration to Europe and how can we reap the benefits of that. And I'm happy to see that that's actually the focus of the discussion today. So I want to make a short pitch saying, first of all, why should we invest in this in the first place? Why do we need regular pathways to Europe? It might be evident to people here in the room. It's not really evident to, let's say, the larger public and even some of the politicians. And the second pitch, of course, is how should we do it? The million-dollar question. How can we actually have well-managed regular pathways to Europe that work and that benefit the country of origin, the countries of destination, and the migrants. So I'll start with the first point on the why. I think Mattia already, gave us an overview of, what are the jobs we expect, to be filled in Europe in the coming years. We also all know that European populations are aging, and to give you a quick number of that, by 2070, over 30% of the European population is forecasted to be over 65 years old. I think that's quite clear that, this will have repercussions on the labor market. We will have skill shortages, and even alone, the need for more caregivers to address, the needs of an aging population is at the forefront. At the same time, we also have this digital transition, the green transition. Certain jobs will disappear, new jobs will come. So we have to look at what that implies for us. Now, at the same time, we see this irregular migration that, continues to happen, and the lack of actual channels for people to migrate to Europe legally, although there might be opportunities for them there. We see that in many cases, people arrive irregularly to work, perhaps without work permits. People arrive perhaps on a tourist visa to then be employed in the agricultural sector. I think there is really a way to deal with this in a better way to make sure people can access regular migration channels for labor migration and otherwise. So there have been some positive initiatives. We already heard about the talent partnerships that were announced in the EU Pact on Migration of Asylum and also formally launched June this year. This is a real opportunity. This is an opportunity to think how can we design a good model. But of course, it is not so easy to make this work, and I wanted to come with maybe just a few suggestions, a few recommendations on how to make sure that future talent partnerships, but more broadly, regular pathways to Europe are actually effective. The first point I would like to recommend is that such pathways, such partnerships really have to be demand-driven and looking at, first of all, what are the needs of the employers, for example, in Europe, but also what are, the labor market situations and dynamics in countries of origin, what are the supplies of skills available, what are the needs also in countries of origin for skills, and how can we design a model around that. If we don't start from that, such partnerships or projects are hardly sustainable. There have been a number of legal migration pilot projects, many from North Africa to Europe. Few of them have been sustainable in the long run because they're heavily subsidized and they're not really grounded in, long-term systems that match with the needs of the private sector. So this is a first part to make sure pathways are sustainable, and we can also look for that at existing migration corridors. Secondly, of course, we have to look for real, genuine partnerships, and the skills mobility partnership model has already been mentioned here. It means we also invest in skills for, migrant workers and workers who stay within their countries of origin. So the genuine partnership is important. We're not just looking at what we need in Europe, we're also considering what is needed in countries of origin and how can we all win from a model like a skills mobility partnership. I would say for this also you need proper frameworks, and bilateral labor migration agreements are one tool for that. Together with ILO, IOM actually also designed a guidance that will be soon launched in terms of, comprehensive labor migration agreements. Third, and a very important point, any regular pathway, any pathway for labor mobility should be rights-based. Ensuring the rights of migrant workers from the recruitment until the employment, possibly even the return. This is really crucial, and unfortunately there are just too many cases of exploitation of migrant workers still in Europe, partially because there are not sufficient legal channels, but even if there are legal channels, still there are cases where, for example, migrant workers pay for recruitment costs, asked by recruitment agencies. How can we avoid that? Migrant workers who do not enjoy, equal pay, or who not have, decent working conditions. So this is something we need to tackle, and there can be very simple measures like, for example, ensuring migrant workers have the right to change employer. That's not always the case. Many regular pathways are still linked to, migrant workers being attached to a specific employer, and this can create situations of abuse, but also, how can we strengthen, for example, the role of the European Labour Authority in this. Maybe a last point on, successful regular pathways. A regular pathway is one thing, but of course it has to be followed also with, support for inclusion of migrants and migrant workers. And someone already referred to that, saying exclusion is always costly, inclusion always pays off. I would fully agree to that. And it's not just a point of, supporting migrant workers to come in. It's also how are we looking at inclusion? How do we combat xenophobia? How do we combat discrimination in our societies? So all in all, I think there's a lot of work to be done to have more, better, regular pathways to Europe so that we can really say that migration, has a positive impact on development. And for this, I think we need a joint response. Public authorities, governments in Europe, in Mediterranean countries, in African countries, civil society, private sector. We all need to work together to promote well-managed and sustainable regular pathways to Europe. So I hope the discussion today can be a start to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are actually short of time because I have 5 speakers already who are already competing for this time. So I'm moving straight away to them in order. I'm sorry for this. Usually I have to fill words after waiting for people, but actually we have many. So I'll just switch online to Karen Whiting, Deputy Representative to Italy, the Holy See and San Marino for UNHCR. Karen, if you can, stick to 3 minutes so that we can all speak.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to intervene. As many of you will know, in the years that followed the 2016 New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, there's been a surge of commitment for resettlement and complementary pathways with safe and legal pathways for admission of refugees to third countries. A wide range of stakeholders have piloted complementary pathways, programs like private or community sponsorship, the Humanitarian Corridors program pioneered by Italy, education corridors that enable refugees to access scholarships, and labor pathways, although as I will go on now, perhaps a little bit less successfully. I'd like to focus my intervention on labor pathways, not to oversimplify things, because it could help resolve 2 important gaps. Firstly, over 82 million forcibly displaced persons worldwide need access to dignified, productive, and decent work. And secondly, as just mentioned by the interveners before me, many countries, including those of the Mediterranean region, rely on immigrants to fill talent gaps and renew their workforce, in many cases due to demographic changes. But despite the opportunities that labor pathways offer both to refugees and to receiving societies, there are a number of challenges that need to be overcome. Firstly, the systems that facilitate refugee access to complementary pathways, like labor pathways, are less developed than those that support resettlement. Refugees face legal, administrative, and practical obstacles to access labor mobility schemes, including eligibility criteria, financial and documentary requirements, as well as challenges obtaining exit permits or finding information on employment opportunities. Importantly, refugees also have particular protection needs and cannot be returned to their country of origin at the end of an employment contract. And then finally, current systems with the registration systems of UNHCR, but also countries of asylum, are not currently designed to capture holistic information on refugees' profiles, skills, and knowledge that would facilitate their matching with employment opportunities in third countries. While there are a number of partnerships that link various actors, including the private sector, civil society, and educational institutions that help us to overcome these obstacles, such as the Global Task Force on Refugee Labor Mobility with Canada as a lead, as well as a recently formed innovation lab created by the Global Solidarity Fund, 10th Partnership for Refugees, and Goal 17, there are still, I think, there's a lot of work to be done. As such, while the presenters have already provided some very interesting information on labor pathways and labor migration, I'd like to ask the interveners if they had suggestions on how we might better grow labor pathways for refugees or include refugees in existing partnerships and models. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karen. Indeed, this is an important policy question. But again, I hope that we can manage to go back to the speakers. Let's see. Next in line is Martin Ruth, chairing Migration Studies and Deputy Director of the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute. So thank you, Martin. You have the floor.
Thank you. One of the benefits of speaking is you can take your mask off for just a minute. I just want to make a brief point about the politics of expanding legal labor migration pathways. And so I suppose the simple observation is that we've talked about this for a long time, right? We've talked about expanding labor migration pathways for many years. And it hasn't happened. Of course, Europe has labor immigration programs, but these are based on a narrow national interest approach, based on discussions about shortages. So it seems to me that if we want to expand these pathways, it's critically important that we ask ourselves, what's going to change? What are the political dynamics around labor migration policies that are going to change, that are going to enable us to expand these pathways? So we need the good ideas that in theory everybody wins, but obviously, I mean, it's an obvious point, think about the politics as well. And I think there's 3 areas or 3 windows of opportunity where that might actually happen, and that's important to think about. One is labor migration around COVID, the COVID pandemic. So I think there's now more talk about essential services, the role migrants play as providers of essential work. And I think there are political opportunities around legalization, around opening legal pathways specifically to facilitate that. The second obvious point that we've talked about today as well is legal labor migration pathways as part of policy cooperations between European and non-EU countries. So is opening up legal migration pathways one of the ways in which these cooperations can be facilitated. And third, I think, goes back to the issue of skills partnerships. I mean, one way of escaping the current frame of labor shortages and difficult debates about do we need migrants or not and what sectors is to reframe the policy altogether as one that's not only a labor migration policy, but also a development policy. So I think that reframing is very, very important, because I'm concerned that if we keep talking about the strict labor migration policy, and if the political dynamics around some of those decisions at member state level don't change, then the good ideas won't actually be translating into actual policy making on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Brief and to the point. It's interesting to note how it's so hard to then, you stimulate the debate around the necessity of key workers, but in the end, even Italy sometimes fails to, tries to regularize them and then somewhat stumbles in the process. Let me move to Mr. Martin Dusay, Consular and Migration Program Manager at the Embassy of Canada in Italy.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to all the participants for a very interesting discussion. Canada is always very interested, not part of the Mediterranean. I wish Canada was part of the Mediterranean. In my hometown, it's -7 and snowing today. But we are extremely happy to see these kinds of dialogue and see projects taking shape in the Mediterranean, between Europe, both sides of the Mediterranean, to shape up programs that will create more legal economic pathways for migrants. I'd like to share a little bit of the experience of Canada on one of our many legal pathways to migrate to Canada. A couple of years ago, we've created an economic mobility pathway for refugees to tap on the skills of refugees to answer some of the labor needs of the labor market in Canada. We've completed the first phase of that pilot, and we're launching the second phase this fall, and we're committed to bring to Canada 500 skilled refugees to Canada over the next 2 years, possibly coming from this region. We intend, if the project goes well, and we're very confident that it's going to go well, that we'll be able to scale up that project quite rapidly and to create another fairly large legal economic pathways for refugees. It's working well, and I wanted just to pick up on many of the excellent interventions that we had today, and one of them was saying about changing the narrative. In the first phase of our pilot, what we've discovered and what we need to improve for the next phase is that we're lacking data about who they are and what skills. And I welcome the intervention of Mr. DiSalvo, who was mentioning the importance of identifying the skills of the migrants. They're not only migrants, they're chemists, they're accountants, they're nurses. And having better data about who they are in terms of their professional skills will help us to make better match, quicker match with the labor needs, and will at the same time change the narratives. It's not that many migrants that are trying to cross the Mediterranean. They are accountant, engineers, nurses, and so on. So even for the public perception, knowing who they are professionally will change the narrative and will bring us closer to make better match for economic pathways. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting insight. Let me move to Mr. El Sayed Torki, Senior Advisor for the Federation of Egyptian Industries.
Thank you so much. I'd like to share with you very briefly our practical experience in this issue in Egypt. The Federation of Egyptian Industries have around 120,000 member companies. We believe in the important role of the private sector to prevent irregular migration and empower existing migrants in Egypt. We have launched an initiative last year with a specific focus on vulnerable groups and vulnerable areas in Egypt. And since November 2020 till now, we have trained and hired around 500 women in the vulnerable areas in Egypt. The point is not only to offer training opportunities for them, but to offer a real decent job opportunities, where we have provided them with training, meals, transportation, insurance, and decent salaries. Starting last April, we have a good cooperation with the IOM Cairo office, where we have launched a pilot project to train 100 migrants and 100 youth from the hosting communities. We find that it was not easy to find the migrants, to find the employers who are ready to train them for 4 months, in spite of lacking of necessary skills. But last few days ago, we have finished the 4 months, and now we are in the process of hiring them. So now we face another challenge, which is a legal challenge concerning obtaining working permits for existing migrants, because the Egyptian law allow to bring migrants from outside Egypt. Migrants or refugees, Egyptian law is treating them as foreigners. So foreigners should be to have a working permit in Egypt to be brought from outside Egypt. This is the first thing. And then the cost of obtaining the working permits is so high. So it is, if you pay for a simple worker, migrant worker, or a doctor or an engineer, it is the same price. But for the engineer, compared to his salary, it will not be expensive for him. So we find that we need a network of smart partnerships where each stakeholders identify its role in order to have a successful scheme for empowering economically and socially migrants. Finally, we have talked about sustainability and SDGs and migration. We need to address the private sector to reallocate part of its CSR funds, which is billions of dollars in Egypt, towards empowering youth of migrants and address part of their creating new job opportunities programs towards migrants, existing migrants in Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's always important to listen from experience on the ground, so thank you for bringing that to the floor. So I'm sorry, but I'm going to take the next 4 speakers already, and then I'm closing the floor. So just to enumerate them, I have Bram Froese, then I will have Eva Martin online, Machelos, Kalisi, and then closing with Filippo Di Robilan. And then I'm sorry, I hope that we have just a minute or two to reply for you as, say, speechers, but I mean, my first important point is to bring everyone to the floor. So, Bram Froese, head of the Mixed Migration Center in Switzerland, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Matteo, and thanks to the organizers. A really interesting discussion so far. I think we all agree that there should be more channels for regular migration, more regular channels for migration. And I think we've all been in many meetings where everybody in the room agreed on that point. I also think no one is in favor of irregular migration, as that's where the most serious abuses against refugees and migrants take place and where the rule of law is undermined. Even though we have to acknowledge that sometimes irregular migration can be the only way to find safety. But I think many challenges remain, even though there are glimmers of hope, like Marta was saying, Germany, the new coalition government, trying to scale up on regular migration. But it's not sufficient, in my opinion. And yes, there are good initiatives, but I feel we're still in this sort of vicious cycle of an eternal small-scale pilots when it comes to regular labor migration. And there's a real lack of political will, of courage and leadership to scale it up. And I think one of the big elephants in the room is the issue of returns, where we see that countries of origin often don't want to cooperate with returns if they're not getting more access to legal channels, to work visa. And on the other side of the table, we see countries of destination that don't want to create more legal channels if they don't get more reassurances on cooperation on returns. So I think we're really in a gridlock there that seems to be hard to break. And a couple of other challenges. I think there are employers, businesses in certain sectors that might actually prefer irregular migration as it can be cheaper. So even if all the evidence points to the value of regular migration, regular pathways, how do we translate that really into political will? And how can we overcome some of these, in my opinion, quite fundamental challenges? Because there's a huge irrationality in the current model when it comes to migration. We see massive amounts spent on migrant smugglers. We see on this other side massive amounts spent on keeping migrants out. Massive amounts on subsidies to businesses and sectors in Europe that then undermine the viability of businesses in Africa. Massive loss of tax incomes due to irregular work. If you all add it up, it just doesn't make sense economically, and it doesn't make sense humanely. And I think it is possible to change, to make migration policies more rational, more humane. I think the ideas are all there. There are great agreements like the Global Compact for Migration, but it's all on paper. It's to a large extent in principle and in theory, but it really lacks implementation. And it's not easy, but as I said, I think it needs political courage, it needs long-term vision, it needs innovation, and it needs evidence. But I still struggle with seeing how all of this really translates into action to create more regular pathways. And I would really like to hear more ideas from the experts in the room. I know we're running out of time, but if there's any way to continue this, this conversation and share more ideas, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Absolutely. Maybe not right now, but during lunch for those who are here, and maybe through mail for those who are online. So let me give the floor to online to Ivan Martin, Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South in Morocco. Ivan, you have the floor. Please stick it, if you can, to 2 minutes so that we can all take part in this.
Thank you. I'm also professor at the University Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. Thank you, Matteo. Yes, I have quite a few points, but I will limit myself to 2 very concrete points on regular pathways, and mainly taking up on the last intervention by Bram and the former ones by Gertrude and by Martin Ruth. I mean, first thing, you have been referring to the talent partnerships, which is, of course, one of the main international cooperation innovations proposed by the European Commission in this field. And I just would like, in line with your discussion before, I would like to propose a reformulation of the name of those schemes and replace talent partnerships, which reminds too much of the rush for talents, which has been shaping the global discussion on international labor migration, by human capital development partnerships. And this would underline and make clear what we are dealing with, and add the development dimension, as Martin Ruth was asking, to the purely labor migration dimension, which seems to be prevailing so far, also in the pilot projects mentioned before. The second point has to do, we are in a Mediterranean forum, and I don't forget that I just came back last week from Tunisia, but we are also in the midst of the conference on the future of Europe launched by the European Commission. And I think one of the major dysfunctionalities so far, Martin was referring to that before, is the fact that the European Union is trying to develop the joint migration policy, but actually in the field of labor migration, admission policy remains at member states level, admission of foreign workers policy. So I would propose, I know that the political context is not the best for one, it would be a big leap forward, but this has happened in other fields of economic policy in Europe. I would really propose, and I think this would be a big step forward, to transfer the competence and the power to admit foreign workers to the European Union level. And this would allow, first, to overcome the very wrong politicization of migration policy in all member states right now, and to bring it back to the more technocratic level of policy making on the basis of needs and the interest of different stakeholders. Second, it would be fully in line with the single market development within the European Union in many fields, including in the field of labor market, which is less developed than in other fields, but this would be fully in line with that. And this would also allow the European Commission to develop this holistic and comprehensive migration cooperation framework with third country partners, including Mediterranean partners, which it cannot do now, because actually the right and the competence to provide and to offer legal pathways to migration still lies with member states. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you for sticking with the time. So a feasible proposal and a very, very difficult proposal. So let me move to the second to last speaker, Mr. Machelos Kalisi, the director of the Mediterranean Universities Union. You have the floor.
Grazie, Matteo. Thank you very much. I would like just to mention the potentiality of, in this topic of universities and the role that they could play on this, and in particular networks around the Mediterranean region. UNIMED is a network of Euro-Mediterranean universities. We have 144 universities from 23 countries around the Mediterranean region. And in particular, we have a sub-network of universities interested to work together on migration issues, and we have 50 universities related to such sub-network. I think that university can do a similar initiative like the cities, in particular, how to, not only to provide a better education, to provide, to reform curricula on migration issues, but in particular to work on the concept of solidarity about migration. If you see several research projects funded by European Commission, they are mostly EU-based, and I think that it could be extremely important to change this perspective and to work on the Mediterranean perspective about migration, and also to think about how to include this Mediterranean strategy looking at Africa, because obviously also the North African countries are affected by, in some way, migration, and also how to include the diaspora, in particular researchers from North Africa and Middle East in this perspective. Obviously looking at the importance of this conference about the future of Europe, probably in particular on migration issue could be interesting also to see about the future of the Mediterranean, looking at the current instability of several southern Mediterranean countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kalisi. Let me move to the last speaker, Filippo Robilant, if you want, and if you can stay to 2 minutes.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Let's see if we can manage to give the reply to them.
Thank you, Chair. No, I agree with what I've heard, all I've heard today. Just two urgencies I see. One, provide income support for migrants predictably and regularly as an effective tool to increase access to essential social services, such as education and health, whether in pandemic times or not. Secondly, reduce migrants' vulnerabilities. In countries of origin, short-term migrant need improved training and more substantial reintegration service. In receiving countries, the development and implementation of standard employment contracts and access to health insurance. This can improve the work and living conditions, especially of female migrants. The complexity of the phenomenon, however, needs bold solutions, and in order to avoid being dismissed as blah, blah, blah by you-know-who, I think we have the onus of finding the key to the problem. Let's face it, risk-taking is inherent to migration. The COVID-19 pandemic has only made it even riskier. However, migration will continue to be part of our lives, whether we like it or not only for those for whom migration embodies the promise for a better and brighter future. We saw this from the survey we carried out today in a very clear way. Thank you.
Thank you, Filippo, for this. And so, going for a close, I will let Ms. Lanneux take up the job for replying for all the panel. No, but really, just some closing remarks, and then we'll move to lunch.
No, I think most were also contributions from other experts rather than questions. So maybe just a very quick reflection on behalf of the panel. Labor pathways for refugees, complementary pathways to resettlement for people in need of protection. Very important indeed, and I think something that's gaining momentum. Also from IOM side, we'll be launching a new program soon to promote labor mobility pathways for people in need of international protection, working with 4 countries in Europe. So definitely it's a priority for us as well. Now, in terms of reframing the discussions and going beyond the box of migration policy, looking also at development policy. This is very important, but I would say even beyond development policy, like we see an opportunity to also look at, the current policies around business and human rights and how to reflect that on protecting migrant workers. For example, there is a new also EU directive in the making on sustainable corporate governance that is an opportunity to see how we also enhance responsibilities of EU-based companies in terms of protection of migrant workers in their operations and supply chains globally. So yeah, we have to look at these different policies, not just the migration part. And finally, finally, the idea of, bringing more competencies on labor migration and admission of migrant workers to the EU. Yes, that's of course an ideal scenario. It's on our wish list. Of course, the framework is very fragmented now with, a few directives here and there on very, specific issues. There's no holistic framework, but unfortunately also no political will right now to transfer such competences to the EU. I think the fact that it took so many years to even come to a revision of the Blue Card Directive shows that it's very hard to get a consensus of EU member states on these topics. But yeah, let's keep it as an ideal scenario in mind. Thank you so much, and I'll stop there.
So what can I say to close this? Thank you so much for coming here today or being present online. It's been like a whirlwind of ideas. It's really, you acknowledge, you realize that you didn't save enough time for the conference just later on. We probably next year will do the double of the time so that we can really get deeper into policy matters. But it's been very important for me, for sure, and I hope for you as well to come together and first of all see each other again, and then discuss crucial, eternal maybe, and recurring, but clearly key policy problems around migration and, governance of migration in the Mediterranean. So with that in mind, lunch is served on the ground floor for those who are here. And we are now at -3, so you just go up one floor and you can take the elevator up. So I'll see you at ground floor. And thank you really for joining us.